January 17, 1943. North Atlantic. 347 hours. The sea is black glass beneath a moonless sky. The German U-boat commander, Kapitänleutnant Klaus Hartmann, stands in the conning tower of U-4 Fevid 6. Salt spray freezing against his leather coat as the submarine cuts through the swells 40 nautical miles west of the Faroe Islands. The wind carries no sound but its own howling. Beneath him, in the cramped control room, 23 men breathe recycled air thick with diesel fumes and human sweat. They believe they are the hunters. They believe these waters belong to them. They have crossed the Atlantic 12 times, sent 42,000 tons of Allied shipping to the bottom, and returned each time to the pens at Lorient, draped in victory pennants. Hartmann scans the horizon with Zeiss binoculars, searching for the dark silhouettes of merchant convoys. He does not know that beneath the surface, 300 meters below his keel, another predator is listening, waiting. The USS Baton Rouge, an American Gato-class submarine, hovers motionless in the thermal layer, her sonar operator's hands resting gently on the sound-powered telephone set, his ears filled with the rhythmic thump-thump-thump of U-456's diesel engines, transmitted through a device the Germans do not yet believe exists in operational form. The Americans call it QC Sonar, active echo ranging, a technological marvel that transforms the ocean itself into a weapon. And in this frozen moment before dawn, the ancient rule of naval warfare is about to reverse itself. The hunter will become the hunted, and an entire generation of German submariners will die without ever understanding how their enemy learned to see in the dark. For 3 years, the German U-boat force had owned the Atlantic, from the Norwegian fjords to the Caribbean shallows, from the Arctic convoys to the African coast. The Kriegsmarine's undersea fleet operated with brutal efficiency that bordered on invincibility. Karl Donitz, the architect of Germany's submarine warfare doctrine, had refined the Wolfpack tactic into a science of coordinated destruction. His boats hunted in groups, guided by long-range reconnaissance aircraft and high-frequency radio transmissions encrypted by the supposedly unbreakable Enigma machine. They surfaced at night to recharge batteries and increase speed, transforming themselves into swift surface raiders that could outrun most escort vessels. During the first 8 months of 1942, they sank over 500 Allied merchant ships, more than 3 million tons of desperately needed supplies sent to the ocean floor. Fuel, food, ammunition, aircraft, tanks, and men, all consumed by the cold Atlantic in explosions of torpedo fire and burning oil. Churchill would later write that the U-boat menace was the only thing that truly frightened him during the entire war, the only threat that made him question whether Britain could survive. The statistics supported his fear. Allied shipbuilding could not keep pace with losses. Crew casualties among merchant mariners exceeded 30%, higher than any other branch of military service, and the Germans were winning because they had mastered 3 fundamental principles: stealth, coordination, and the hunter's advantage of striking from concealment. What they did not know was that American naval engineers and physicists had been working since 1940 to strip away all 3. The technology that would revolutionize submarine warfare had its origins not in military laboratories but in the commercial fishing industry and geological surveys. Sonar, sound navigation and ranging, relied on a principle understood since the ancient Greeks. Sound travels through water far more efficiently than through air, and objects in the water reflect sound waves back to their source. In 1906, Lewis Nixon patented one of the first underwater listening devices in the United States. During the First World War, both British and American researchers developed passive hydrophones that could detect submarine propellers at ranges up to several miles. But passive listening had severe limitations. It required absolute silence aboard the detecting vessel. It could not determine precise range, and it was nearly useless against a stationary or slowly moving target. Active sonar, sending out a sound pulse and measuring the time it took to bounce back, had been theorized for decades, but engineering a system that could generate sufficient power, survive the marine environment, and provide usable tactical information required advances in electronics, transducer design, and signal processing that did not exist until the late 1930s. The British developed ASDIC for surface ships, naming it after the Allied Submarine Detection Investigation Committee. The Americans developed QC sonar specifically for submarine versus submarine warfare, and by 1942, They were installing it on every new fleet boat rolling off the construction ways at Electric Boat Company and Mare Island Naval Shipyard. The equipment itself would have seemed alien to a U-boat commander. In the forward torpedo room of American Gato-class submarines, technicians installed a retractable transducer dome containing a quartz crystal array that could emit focused acoustic pulses at frequencies between 20 and 30 kilohertz, far above the range of human hearing, but perfectly tuned to propagate through seawater with minimal attenuation. When energized by high-voltage electrical pulses, these crystals vibrated, creating pressure waves that radiated outward through the ocean like ripples from a stone dropped in a pond. When those waves struck an object, a submarine hull, a whale, a school of fish, the ocean floor, they reflected back. The same crystal array that generated the pulse acted as a receiver, converting the returning pressure waves back into electrical signals. In the submarine sound room, operators wearing bulky headphones watched oscilloscope screens and listened to the characteristic ping of transmitted pulses and the fainter echo returns. By measuring the time interval between transmission and echo, they could calculate range with trigonometric precision. By rotating the transducer dome and comparing signal strength, they could determine bearing. And by analyzing the Doppler shift in the returning frequency, they could estimate target speed and heading. For the first time in history, a submarine could detect, track, and target another submarine without visual contact, without surfacing, without betraying its own position until the moment it chose to attack. But technology alone meant nothing without doctrine, training, and commanders willing to abandon decades of naval tradition. The American submarine force in 1941 was built around the same philosophical foundation as the German U-boats. Submarines were commerce raiders, designed to sink merchant shipping and avoid direct combat with enemy warships whenever possible. American boats carried deck guns for surface actions and torpedoes optimized for targeting slow-moving cargo vessels. Their commanders were trained in patient stalking, carefully maneuvering into attack position over hours or even days before launching spreads of torpedoes. The idea of using submarines as anti-submarine weapons seemed almost paradoxical. It violated the principle of specialization that had governed naval architecture for centuries. Yet as the war progressed and German U-boats increasingly threatened the Atlantic lifeline, American naval strategists began to recognize a crucial asymmetry. U-boats had to transit certain choke points to reach their hunting grounds. They had to pass through the Greenland-Iceland-UK gap. They had to enter and exit the Bay of Biscay from French ports. They congregated in areas where Allied convoys were most vulnerable. And in those transit zones and operational areas, American submarines with active sonar could reverse the equation, hunting the hunters in a war of attrition that would slowly bleed the Kriegsmarine's most experienced crews into the cold Atlantic depths. The doctrine emerged gradually, refined through trial and bitter error. Early attempts at anti-submarine patrols failed because American commanders treated U-boats like merchant ships, trying to achieve the perfect firing solution before attacking. But U-boats were fast, maneuverable, and equipped with hydrophones of their own. They could detect torpedo propellers and take evasive action. The breakthrough came when submarine commanders began using sonar not just for targeting, but for persistent tracking, stalking German boats for hours, forcing them to remain submerged, draining their batteries, limiting their mobility, and attacking from unexpected angles when the enemy was most vulnerable. They learned to exploit thermal layers in the ocean that bent sound waves, making submarines invisible to sonar when positioned correctly. They developed the down-the-throat shot, firing torpedoes directly at an approaching U-boat before it could launch its own weapons. They coordinated with long-range patrol aircraft and surface hunter-killer groups, creating interlocking nets of detection that gave German commanders fewer and fewer places to hide. And they maintained absolute radio silence about their methods, allowing the Kriegsmarine to remain ignorant of why their boats were dying with increasing frequency in waters they had once dominated. The Germans knew something had changed. In the wardrooms and submarine pens from Lorient to Bergen, commanders traded stories that made no tactical sense. Boats returning from patrol reported phantom sounds, metallic pings that seemed to come from nowhere, always followed within hours by torpedo attacks from American submarines operating at depths and ranges that should have been impossible. Some attributed it to new Allied aircraft radar. Others believed the Americans had captured Enigma machines and were reading U-boat position reports. A few suspected acoustic homing torpedoes. though German intelligence insisted the Allies lacked such technology. No one guessed the truth, that American submarines were using the ocean itself as a medium for vision, that they could detect targets at ranges exceeding 3,000 meters, that they were operating with a sensory advantage comparable to fighting a blind opponent. German naval engineers had developed their own active sonar systems before the war, but testing had revealed problems with reliability, power consumption, and the fundamental disadvantage that active sonar broadcasts the hunter's position to anyone listening. They concluded that passive hydrophones were more tactically sound, and they never reconsidered that assessment even as their casualty rates climbed toward catastrophic levels. Captain Lieutenant Klaus Hartmann never returned from that January patrol. British Admiralty records, declassified in 1976, show that U-456 was sunk on January 23, 1943, approximately 100 nautical miles southwest of Iceland. The attackers were initially listed as unknown, possibly aircraft or surface vessels, but American submarine patrol logs released a decade later tell a different story. The USS Baton Rouge trailed U-456 for 17 hours after the initial contact, maintaining sonar tracking even when the German boat went deep and silent, following the acoustic signature of its electric motors and the slight mechanical noise of its propellers. At 16:40 hours on January 23rd, as U-456 attempted to surface to recharge batteries in gathering darkness, Baton Rouge closed to 1,200 meters and fired 4 Mark 14 torpedoes in a spread pattern. 2 struck the U-boat amidships, breaking its pressure hull in multiple locations. The German submarine sank in less than 90 seconds, too fast for the crew to escape. There were no survivors. In his patrol report, Lieutenant Commander Robert Hammond of the Baton Rouge wrote with clinical precision, "Target prosecuted using QC sonar continuous tracking. Attack executed from depth without visual confirmation. Post-attack sonar contact showed rapid descent and hull breakup sounds, consistent with catastrophic flooding. 23 German submariners died without ever seeing their killer, without understanding how they had been found, without knowing that the technological advantage they had enjoyed for 3 years had evaporated like morning fog." The scope of this silent transformation remains difficult for modern readers to fully grasp. Cushioned as we are by satellites and GPS and computers, that process information at speeds that would seem like magic to wartime sailors. To understand what active sonar meant in 1943 requires imagining warfare conducted almost entirely through sound and intuition, where visibility extended perhaps 50 meters on a clear day if you were surfaced, and 0 in the perpetual midnight below 100 meters depth. German U-boat commanders navigated by dead reckoning, celestial navigation, and brief periscope glimpses of coastlines or convoy smoke. They hunted by listening for propeller sounds through passive hydrophones, calculating intercept courses based on bearing changes measured over hours, surfacing at night to close distance and attack with deck guns or torpedoes aimed optically through the periscope. Every decision was made with incomplete information. Every attack was a gamble balanced against the risk of counterattack. And the entire tactical framework assumed that submarines were essentially invisible when submerged, that the ocean depths provided sanctuary where patience and skill could overcome superior enemy numbers. Active sonar shattered that assumption completely. It transformed the ocean from an opaque hiding place into a transparent medium where American submarines could detect, track, and kill German boats with an efficiency that bordered on mechanical slaughter. The statistical evidence emerged slowly, compiled by German naval intelligence officers who struggled to understand why their experienced commanders were dying. In 1941, the Kriegsmarine lost 35 U-boats from all causes. In 1942, the number rose to 87. But 1943 would be the killing year. Over the 12 months between January and December 1943, German submarine losses reached 244 boats, more than 20 per month, nearly 1 every day. Of those, approximately 40% were sunk by aircraft, 30% by surface escort vessels, and 30% by causes listed as unknown or uncertain. It is within this final category that American submarines operated, rarely claiming credit in public, their patrol reports classified at levels higher than most battle plans. Historians examining declassified documents after the Cold War concluded that American submarines accounted for at least 30 German U-boats during 1943 alone, with the true number likely higher. given incomplete records and shared kill credits with aircraft or surface vessels. What made these losses particularly devastating for the Kriegsmarine was not just the numbers but the experience level of the crews. American submarines hunting in the Atlantic transit zones targeted U-boats moving to and from operational areas. These were often veteran boats commanded by officers who had survived a dozen patrols, men whose expertise and instincts were irreplaceable. When a boat like U-456 disappeared with all hands, Germany lost not just the vessel, but thousands of hours of accumulated tactical knowledge. The veteran commanders died first, killed by an enemy they could neither see nor comprehend, and the replacements sent to fill their ranks faced survival odds that declined with every passing month. The symbolic weight of this technological disparity extended far beyond tactical considerations. German submariners had been told they were the elite, the sharp point of a revolutionary military force that would strangle Britain and change the course of history. They wore the distinctive white-topped service caps and leather jackets that marked them as different from ordinary sailors. They received extra pay and privileges. Hitler himself praised them as the Iron Men in iron boats, warriors who carried the spirit of the Prussian military tradition into a new age of mechanized warfare. Their success in 1941 and 1942 seemed to confirm this narrative. They sank ships faster than the Allies could build them. They operated with impunity from the Gulf of Mexico to the Cape of Good Hope. And they did this while outnumbered, undersupplied, and facing increasingly sophisticated countermeasures. The fact that they continued achieving results against such odds reinforced the Nazi ideology of German technical and spiritual superiority. But by late 1943, that ideology was colliding with a reality it could not explain. U-boats were dying in situations where they should have held every advantage. Deep water, darkness, no enemy contacts reported by their hydrophone operators. The survivors who made it back to port described a new kind of fear. Not the clean terror of depth charge attacks or aircraft strafing, but a creeping dread that something was watching them, tracking them through the depths with senses they could not match. Some called it the invisible hunter. Others whispered about Allied supernatural capabilities, about death rays and secret weapons that could see through water and steel. None of these explanations challenged the core Nazi belief in German superiority. They merely externalized the failure, blaming Allied luck or unfair advantages rather than confronting the possibility that American engineers had simply built better tools and trained their sailors to use them more effectively. The sonar operators aboard American submarines came from backgrounds that German naval officers would have dismissed as impossibly plebeian. They were farm boys from Iowa who had grown up listening for changes in tractor engine noise. They were radio technicians from Chicago who understood signal processing through years of amateur electronics tinkering. They were jazz musicians from New Orleans with perfect pitch who could distinguish between the harmonic frequencies of different submarine models. The Navy trained them at sound schools in Key West and New London, teaching them to identify contacts by acoustic signature, the rhythmic thump of diesel engines, the high whine of electric motors, the specific blade rate frequency of different propeller designs. They learned to compensate for water temperature, salinity, and pressure effects that bent sound waves and created false echoes. They developed an almost supernatural ability to extract signal from noise, to hear the faint ping return of a distant target against the background chaos of whales, shrimp wave action, and their own submarine's machinery. And they did this in working conditions that would have broken lesser men. 12-hour watches in rooms barely larger than a closet, wearing headphones that pressed against their skulls until their ears bled, staring at oscilloscope screens that burned after images into their retinas, knowing that a moment's inattention might mean torpedoes crashing through their own hull. The best sonar operators could estimate range within 50 meters, bearing within 1 degree, and target aspect angle within 5 degrees, all from the subtle characteristics of acoustic returns. They were artists of sound working in a medium invisible to everyone else aboard, and they were as responsible for Allied victory in the Atlantic as any admiral or aircraft carrier task force. The technology itself evolved with remarkable speed. Early QC sonar systems installed in 1941 had effective ranges of approximately 1,500 meters under ideal conditions, required several minutes to train onto a target, and suffered from frequent mechanical breakdowns. By 1943, improved transducer designs and more powerful amplifiers extended range to 3,000 meters. By 1944, American submarines were receiving experimental systems that could scan automatically, tracking multiple contacts simultaneously, while the submarine maneuvered at flank speed. Some boats received the QLA model, which added a separate listening array optimized for detecting submerged targets at ultra-long range, providing cueing information that allowed the attack sonar to go active only when a target was already localized. Others tested frequency-modulated continuous wave systems that eliminated the distinctive ping sound in favor of a continuous chirp that was harder for enemy hydrophone operators to detect. And in the final year of the war, American submarines in the Pacific began carrying sonobuoys, expendable acoustic sensors that could be deployed to create temporary detection nets around Japanese submarine operating areas. None of these innovations reached the public consciousness during the war. News reports and propaganda films focused on torpedo attacks against Japanese warships, on daring rescues of downed pilots, on surface gun actions that could be filmed and dramatized. The revolution in undersea warfare remained classified, its heroes anonymous technicians and operators whose names appeared in patrol reports sealed for decades. For the Germans, the psychological impact of this invisible predation proved as destructive as the material losses. U-boat morale, which had remained remarkably high through 1942 despite increasing danger, began to collapse in 1943 as crews faced patrol after patrol with declining survival odds. Letters and diaries recovered from captured submariners reveal a growing sense of fatalism, a belief that death was inevitable and survival